Hello, everybody. I am so glad to be here with you today with a panel of incredible guests for Worlds Without Walls, Jewish Anti-Zionism in TTRPGs. I am David Jones Krause. I will be moderating. I use any pronouns. I'm an agender pan ADHDer. I've composed soundtracks for games like Forgery and actual plays like Beach Episodes. I'm currently working on a Delicious in Dungeon inspired actual play, along with a bespoke game to go along with it. And I was raised Jewish, specifically Ashkenazi. And I'm whoever feels moved. I would love for y'all to introduce yourselves. Yeah.
I'm Rowan Zioli. I am a journalist with Rascal News. The pronouns are she, they. I was raised Jewish, though I have a agnostic, formerly Roman Catholic father, and Jews and Roman Catholics have a lot in common. Um, I am queer, I am ADHD, I am chronically ill, and I'm Aries Sun, Libra Moon, and Cap Rising. Yeah. Take it away.
I am Z. Hello. I use they, them pronouns. I was interesting, raised by a Jewish father and a Lutheran mother. Then halfway through my childhood, my father converted to being Lutheran, and my brother and I stayed Jewish. Which is wild.
We love it.
I'm a writer living in Los Angeles. I am a semi-professional dungeon master. I'm the writer of a podcast, or I'm the lead for the podcast, What Happened in the Malachite Wastes. And yeah, I'm very excited to be, I use they, them pronouns. I don't know if I said that. And I'm very excited to be part of this panel.
Cool. I'm NL. I'm a Michigan-based TTRPG author. I was raised a conservative Jew. But, things come and go as you're older, and so I have not been in a synagogue in years. But it's a big part of my cultural identity, and I'm excited to be here. So thank you for having me. And I use they, them pronouns.
I guess I'll go. Sorry. My name is Max Pfeffer. I am also Jewish, as you can probably tell from this panel. I grew up in the Sacramento region of Northern California as a Reform Jew. Grew up going to synagogue, Sunday school, had a bar mitzvah, had the very traditional Reform Jewish upbringing, and then went to college and whatnot, all those good things. And I am a Jewish tabletop role-playing game designer. So I design several Jewish games. You might have heard of Hanukkah Goblins, which is based off of the very famous children's book, Herschel and the Hanukkah Goblins. That was released several years ago. And my next game upcoming is called Esther and the Queens, and it's a Purim-based game that explores a queer and feminist retelling of the Purim story, featuring one of our ancestors in the Talmud, Rabbi Yochanan. So that is one way I've kind of expressed my Judaism as an adult, is doing game design using Judaism. And I use no pronoun. And I will pass it off to Tasha.
Thanks, everyone. Hi, I'm Tasha Iglesias. I am an editor and writer currently over here in the Bay Area, but originally from LA. I identify as non-religious Ashkenazi Jew, born and raised in the Reform tradition, but it's more of a cultural and ethnic thing for me now. I also identify as Latina, specifically with the Cuban background. I am queer. I am a D&D obsessive, and currently a DM in a non-professional way, but it feels like a profession. Game. Yes, it feels like a profession with the amount of work I put in. But yeah, avid D&D consumer, player, DMer, lover. Oh, fantastic. And I use she, her pronouns. Yeah.
Great. I really appreciate y'all. Before we get into the questions, I want to answer the question of why this panel? Very Jewish premise, to question the premise. If you're watching this, you're probably aware of the controversies surrounding Gen Con this year. I would refer you to Rowan's article on the subject if you want like a real detailed accounting. I think it's a really great article. But the TLDR for the VOD watchers of the future is that in the reactionary backlash of the statement from the Crit Awards that regarded Zionism as a hateful and oppressive ideology, Gen Con allegedly disinvited them. I don't know for certain, but while this portrayal of Zionism is often misconstrued as anti Semitic, we're living contradictions to the notion of a unilateral Jewish support for a colonial ethno state in active perpetration of a genocide, which began in earnest nearly 75 years ago. So, with that in mind, everyone here is a storyteller of some variety, of maybe multiple or many varieties. Transmuting narrative building blocks into kernels of meaning feels like a profoundly Jewish act. And at a time when it's easy to feel estranged from family and community, I wanted to start by checking in with you all about the ways that TTRPGs have been a source of connection to yourself, your Jewishness, your community, and whoever feels moved to answer first.
So that's such an interesting question. And I actually think that for me personally, I found a lot of like solace in the TTRPG community. I think being an anti-Zionist Jewish person right now is, I can imagine for all of us, has been very alienating from sometimes from both sides. And a friend who, as a Black queer, like an Afro-Latino queer Jewish man who grew up in a mainly white society, we'd been talking a lot about how we were feeling and that sort of thing. And in this world of our podcast, wanted to essentially create like a sorcery class based on Judaism. The people in the land is called Hesha, and this idea that like there's an islands that float in the sky, and they were left behind after Hesha made this promise that like people could find it. And the idea that we kind of came up with is that in finding this land, the Hesha had a thing called the promise, which is we were living in exile. We were living as refugees for such a long time that anyone who was living in exile, any person in diaspora, could find a home in this land. And I think for both of us, even though within the story, like Hashem is a very complicated religion and culture, and it's not like all smiles and rainbows, the fact that we wanted to create it specifically as an anti-Zionist, or like a way that there could be a Jewish, like a Hessian homeland, but it was also supposed to specifically be for anyone who needed a home. I think that's been a really kind of healing principle for both of us to explore a version of Judaism that we want to see in the world and that we believe is actually much more akin to what Judaism is about.
For sure. I mean, it sounds like it's really grounded in like restorative values, which is, I feel like we would all say pretty different from our relationship to Zionism, how we regard it. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely had been. I was raised. I went to a lot of Jewish summer camps. I went to a lot of Jewish day schools. And Zionism was definitely kind of the undercurrent, all of that. When I was like 7 or 8, I made a Israel board game because that was one of the assignments that we had. I recently found it again. It was real weird. But I don't know, one of the things that has always stuck with me at the basis of Judaism, at the core of who I am, has been the twofold practice of making the world a better place, repairing the world, bringing it together, trying to fix it, and the idea of always questioning everything. And knowing that even within, like, 2 Jews, 3 opinions is like the most basic understanding of Judaism that exists. And so being a journalist in the tabletop space for me specifically has really brought that to the forefront, because tabletop games have a really therapeutic value in a lot of ways. They have a way to build community and bring people together. And as my role as a journalist in the space, being able to uplift the people doing that work to repair relationships with each other, to reformat stories like we're going to talk about a little bit later, and questioning those in power who tell you that things are supposed to be the way that they are and that there's no possibility of things to get better. And so especially writing that Gen Con story, kind of being like, okay, what's going on? How is all of this happening? The most important part of questioning everything is to come at it, step away, and really look at it holistically and be like, what are the assumptions that I am bringing to this? What are the assumptions other people are bringing to this? And where in the middle is the truth? And once we find that truth collectively, how can we move forward? And so that's something I think tabletops and the community around them are really, really good for.
Yeah, I mean, and I think what you've spoken to some in that, like, the like, spot on, the two Jews, three opinion thing is like, that is an act of radical empathy to some extent, right? This ability to like step outside of the narrowness of a singular perspective. And it's so evident in your work as a journalist.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Go ahead, Tasha.
Okay. Just to jump in on my end, I think, so the Jewish like collective identity, or even like a personalized take on it, has always been a bit fraught for me. You know, I don't have family except for my mother due to being like a Holocaust survivor. And then also, I don't even have a lot of family from my father's side because him and his like very small nuclear family fled Castro. So lots of just talk about like the diaspora experience. I felt like I didn't have much like history or tradition to draw upon in order to like find out who I am in terms of them. It was very much who am I in terms of just me and my current experience. And I think what was fraught about that is that I grew up in a very trigger warning here, a very abusive, a toxic home. So I think I often found solace in stories and solace in the imaginary. It felt like where I wanted to be all the time. And something that's so empowering about TTRPGs is that it's simultaneously storytelling and imagination, but also community, which was something I lacked. And it's communal, interactive, collaborative storytelling. And you could be an adventurer that is on their own, very much like how I felt, but you have made and found a found family. And you are also exploring, I think, what really excited me, which was like the magic of history and lore and the unknown, which was my entire childhood experience. My own identity was an unknown. I didn't have access to like tradition wholeheartedly or like the lore of my ancestry wholeheartedly. And so creating one collaboratively with a found family, I think was incredibly empowering and alluring. Now as an adult, who's sort of in charge of my own game, it's been really fun to infuse my personal ideals and politics into the stories I create and use that to critique things like capitalism, like xenophobia, like racism, in a way where me and my found family are doing it, of course, within our lines and veils, within our comfort level. But it's another way, I think, for us to be navigating our identities and our struggles in a safe found family way. So I think that's how I would say TTRPGs have been a source for connection. And in a way, me sort of trying to parallel some of the ancestries or identities that I didn't wholeheartedly have access to.
Okay. Sorry. Go ahead, Dave.
No, please. If what you feel like you have to say dovetails off that, I'm all for it.
Yeah, I want to dovetail off what how Tasha was talking about community and how Judaism tabletop kind of facilitates that. A lot of people, Judaism is a very broad experience. People grew up in a synagogue environment. Some people grow up with a Jewish parent that you didn't grow up in a synagogue or Jewish community environment. I think kind of coming from the growing up in synagogue perspective, when you become an adult and you leave your nuclear family household, if that was your experience, the temple was always the center of where you had your Jewish identity. You went to temple for services, you went to temple for your Hanukkah celebration or whatever celebration. And as you go into the world, there isn't that kind of source, that center of community anymore for a lot of people, because participating in a synagogue is actually quite expensive for a lot of people, or you're just in a new environment. Like, you grew up in one place and now you're living in another. And as we've kind of talked about a little bit in the beginning, but synagogue environments typically are very Zionist environments, that the people who are in that world intertwine your Jewish identity with the support of a ethno-state of Israel. So coming in as, anti-Zionist Jew as an adult, it's difficult to find that place of community if you don't have kind of almost like a nice place to go to. And I think tabletop is a great way to see that. There's people doing Jewish actual plays, there's people designing Jewish games, or there's even just GMs who are just bringing their Jewishness into a secular game. There's just so much about the Jewish upbringing, and we talked about 2 Jews, 3 opinions. All of those things, if you are a Jewish person playing a game, your identity just naturally gets infused into whatever game you're playing. And I think it's just a fun way to explore your identity, if that's something you choose to do in games.
Yeah, I love that. And I think what you really touched on is something I think we probably all feel, which is that, like, Jewish spaces, the spaces we are meant to feel safe right now, don't feel particularly safe to exist in as a Jewish person who is explicitly anti-Zionist. Yeah, no, makes a world of sense.
I find that very touching, Max. Actually, it's been a second since I've talked to other Jews, I'll be honest. There's not a lot around me, and I haven't been to synagogue in a while, like I said, and so I've been feeling really disconnected from it, outside of my family, who unfortunately are not the most anti-Zionist in the world. And I guess the big thing I always think about is, like, Judaism specifically is this weird dual identity where you're born to an ethnicity and also packaged with a religion. I know that's, like, very obvious, right, to all of us, but it's just this, like, weird place of being expected to both be born with, like, this truth about yourself and where your family comes from, but also with, like, a set of ideals and beliefs that come with it. And I think I spent a lot of my teen years feeling burdened by it, which maybe sucks to say a little, but, like, just feeling like I had this weight of a huge community behind me and this history and religious practice and being expected to go to classes and learn these things. And I'm sure everyone feels that in some way about their identities in general, but it just felt so heavy. And I personally use tabletop role-playing games as an outlet, writing them more so, trying to show players what it's like to be saddled with things that you don't particularly want to start with. Because I think some of the most interesting choices in fiction come from, like, here are your circumstances, like, now make the best of it. And that's very much how I feel about being Jewish. And there's a lot of joy in it too, but there's sometimes just that idea of, like, yeah, having this history, having and a story to continue, and what feels honestly like a cultural duty for preservation and for community, which I do enjoy too, and I think is important. But I see other people, non-Jews, sometimes, not regard themselves as being responsible in that way. And I think everyone should be. So it's I don't know. It's a very unique perspective on, like, world stewardship, I think. Stewardship. Anyway.
Yeah, 1,000, and I want to really name something you touched on, which is, like, there are forces of culture that like we all exist under different forces of culture. Tasha, you mentioned like capitalism, pretty pervasive force of culture in the world we live in. But like acknowledging them and understanding the way that they affect our lives, our upbringing, the expectations they place on us is something that a lot of people are not doing.
Yeah.
And I just, for added context, NL's game Print Weaver specifically, your starting character is based on what your fingerprints allocate you, and that really
Yeah.
informs play right from the jump. So
Yeah.
very evident in
Yeah, and that's the idea. I mean, you're given all of your items and your stats, and you don't have a say in the matter. And specifically with Print Weaver, I didn't want to talk too much about my own work, but this is kind of part of the point. You are, because your character has fingerprints, you are also assigned the religion of being a traveler in the world of Print Weaver. So like it's very, I wrote it very Catholic coded, but it's Jewish because it's my own experience. I just like the gargoyle aesthetic, the Gothic stuff. But that idea of like you're being called to be a hero in a world and you were born that way, I find very fascinating. And it's very much how it relates to Judaism. It's like being told, you know, there are these morals and these guidelines that you'll need to bring into the world, these mitzvahs you'll have to complete. And that's part of your right by birth. Like that, and that's just something that you're gonna do. And being raised, like told to do that, just felt crazy to me as a child. But I think there's definitely parts I embrace now.
Yeah.
Just a lot. It's a lot to tell a kid, I think. Yeah.
No, absolutely, and I think there's something. If I could sort of take that and run with it into, we've talked a fair amount about the second question I'd written there, and I think what you're describing segues pretty well into the third question that I shared with y'all about this notion of like what do we choose to take with us? What parts of our experience do we choose to carry forward, and how do we make those decisions? You know, I in the context of that question described the difference between like remembering and re-traumatization, right? I think we've all seen some version of the Holocaust happened to us, so you need to do everything you can, like rather not so you need to do everything you can to fight fascism, but rather so you should always be afraid of people coming after you specifically. And like that distinction, that delineation, I think is like yeah, I think it's valid to have trauma around that. And do we want to live in a world where we are healing from that trauma, where we are experiencing our grief and using it as fuel for making the world a better place? I mean, I think the answer is probably yes. But I would love to hear from y'all in terms of like, um, what if there's been any sort of like guiding force for you in terms of choosing what to hold on to and what to let go.
Yeah, I think for me personally, it has come through looking at intersectional studies in a lot of ways. Learning from like Black liberation leaders specifically, because a lot of the problems of Zionism that we're currently facing, and a lot of that rehashing of generational trauma that you were just speaking to, of always be afraid because the Holocaust can happen at any moment. I was constantly growing up with other Jewish friends who were like, the Holocaust is going to happen again. People are going to come after us. Like, I would have nightmares as a kid about things like that happening. And this is a thing that happens to a lot of various identities, that they choose to embrace white supremacy as a way to stay safe. They choose to embrace oppression and becoming the oppressor, because if you ally yourself with the oppressor, you can no longer be harmed. And the deep internalized understanding that the only way to not be harmed is to not exist. And that's just not an option. And so the only way to avoid that is truly by finding solidarity with other people and understanding collectively that we all are suffering under the same things, because even white people suffer from white supremacy, because the same way men suffer from patriarchy. You are forced into a little box and your expression of self is limited. And so once you start to embrace the rainbow of diversity that there is, and understanding that the only limitations that exist are limitations that you put on yourself out of fear, leaning away from that and leaning into a collective love for everyone else and putting that into your fiction is, in my life, how I've reframed that fear.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that I had never heard that before. That the only way to be safe is to not exist. But it reminds me so much of there's a Rosa Luxemburg quote. She's describing how she has no special place in her heart for the suffering of her people, of the Jews, and she says, "I'm at home wherever there are clouds and birds and human tears." And this acknowledgement that like inherent to human existence is suffering, but it that idea of like keeping just yours safe is a harmful one. Yeah. Thank you.
I think also with the generational trauma, like I think it's a really strong impetus to, take it upon ourselves to be protectors and be, people who are forming that solidarity, making those connections, looking out for people who are suffering. That's kind of the core of my anti-Zionism, is that like, and I think that's true for a lot of people, is just, never again, obviously. And I think that comes so heavily when you're raised looking at the history and, only being a few generations from these horrific acts, that the very clear moral is that it can't happen again. And yeah, I think that's imbued in just the Jewish identity to me, and it feels like such a gross rejection of it to do otherwise, but
Yeah.
There's something so. Oh.
No,
I keep going at the same time as other folks.
Ashley,
I'm
you go
so sorry.
Tag you in, Asha.
It's the millennial pause.
It's the millennial pause of like the Zoom Discord limbo. I think I would really love to touch on the remembering without re-traumatization and like exploring that path to like wholeness, or at least to being seen, or like some type of healing. But like, how do you do it in a way that doesn't, that's not counterproductive or even detrimental? I mean, I think for me personally, by playing in this play world, there's enough of a removal where I can then go like, role play past stuff I gotta work through, role play my thoughts and feelings about like xenophobia in this like fake world. And it doesn't mean that it doesn't feel as impactful or that it's not as serious, because I don't know about any of y'all, but when I'm role playing with my players, I'm in it. But it also feels safe enough because it is this agreed upon space that we all laid boundaries down for specifically, that I actually feel like I'm able to work through things that I think many of us have been subjected to or are just existing in a way that feels cathartic, even if it is like a tough session, right? Even if it's a tough session that doesn't end on a good beat. It feels like juicy. It feels really fulfilling, at least for me personally. And I think that, the thing about this question is that the answer is so subjective, because everyone has like the specific things that make them feel like they are on the healing path or make them feel re-traumatized. And I think it's so dependent on the table or on the context. But I think personally for me, I really enjoy going there. I really enjoy like digging deep and getting into some of the gnarly stuff that I think in the real world I'd be like, no, I don't want any of this right now. I deal with it all the time. But there's something about the play space with your found family where you are creating this story to work through all this stuff, or at least in part to kind of go through it, that feels healing, even if it is like, a little bit spicy with how much you can dig deep to some of that hard stuff. So Yeah, just like a side entry to that question, I feel, is my answer.
I think Tasha's answer is so interesting because in how you're talking about the entry into Judaism, that's sort of my cultural identity entry into Judaism, because my grandfather was a communist and my great-grandfather was a communist. My great-grandmother was a Jewish woman. My grandparents tried to assimilate and distance themselves from both of those things as much as possible. So by the time that my dad was born and being raising us, Judaism was something that culturally he identified with. But the fact of the matter is, like, part of the reason my father converted was because he found the idea of Zionism reprehensible. Like, he had built so much of his identity around that as a child, and adulthood could not reconcile the idea that Zionism and Judaism were not things that you could separate, and found a community in a Christian space that was much more welcoming and much more supportive. We were very lucky that way. Like, it was a very like LGBT, you know, friendly. Like, it was a much more, you know, Berkeley in the 90s space. But I think what's interesting about that from my perspective is that I came into Judaism as essentially an academic. Like, I majored in ancient rabbinic hermeneutics. Like, I was studying religion. I was studying Judaism from a perspective of, like, I wasn't bringing the same weight of Zionism and cultural significance of, like, self-preservation into my approach to Judaism. And so the things that really stood out to me were things that were talking about all the rabbinic commentaries about what is in the Talmud. You know what I mean? Like, it's the ideas of, like, specifically that I think the modern Jewish identity of Zionism is based very much on a Christian ideology of Zionism, because fundamentally, to believe that we should be back in we are the chosen people, we should be back in the Holy Land, is very much determined on, like, messianic culture. And to me, like, the things that I took out of my study of Judaism was, like, anti-theodicy was the biggest thing that Job says to God, like, not just, I think you're doing this to me for these reasons, but I think you're doing this to me because you're bad. This is not kind. And, like, God essentially says, like, Job, I created the earth. Were you there when I created the Leviathan? Screw you. You don't have anything to say about it. But at the same time, like, he gets everything he needed and wanted back. And I think the idea that, like, we can't push back against our own cultural identity in the way that we could push back against God, like, big G, you know, it seems reductive to me. It seems that Judaism has never been a faith-based religion, and to believe in Zionism, to me, seems like a faith-based, like, it's like, we don't question it, this is just what God said. And it's like, yeah, but is it? Like, the idea that when God spoke to Moses on Zion, that is supposed to be an eternal moment, that is the moment that, like, whenever we are reading Torah, whenever we are studying, whenever we are praying, whenever we are in discussion like we are right now, talking about God and talking about Judaism, that is the living word. That is, we are supposed to be growing. We are supposed to be learning and gleaning truth from the things that are written and the things that are said. And the fact that Zionism is, like, the one thing that we're, like, not supposed to do that with, it's such a product, I think specifically you see it very reactionarily rise, like, post the Holocaust. It's a product of trauma. It's a product of self-preservation. And while I think we can all understand being not just Jews, but also I think all people who are in groups that face persecution outside of that identity, the instinct for self-preservation is strong. Is it the thing that we want to guide our lives? Do we become the abuser and perpetuate the cycle of abuse by disallowing by perpetuating the same harm that was caused against us. And I think if you actually are in like the Jewish tradition as it is like as study and that is appreciated, I think Zionism is fundamentally the controversial thing. I think it's fundamentally anti-Jewish.
Yeah. I mean, sorry, please.
Yeah, no, just as a jump in thing and talking about the living word. I can't remember the story, but there are two rabbis who are arguing, and God comes down and is like, "He's right," and then the other rabbi's like, "Hey, actually, this is none of your business. We're here on Earth."
Rowan was literally about to bring up that same joke. Just the like, yeah, like God's opinion almost is just another opinion in the mix rather than the opinion.
Yeah. No, I mean, and I'll even name that Tasha and I, when I was brainstorming questions to ask y'all, talked about the idea that like inherent in Midrash and like yeshiva in general, it's all basically fan fiction, right? Like it is all just like people writing and talking about this book that they really like. And like
Lilith is coming in and topping people, man.
yeah, yes.
They can read like a gossip column. They're just like, no.
The amount of like shit talking that happens on specific interpretations in later yeah, 1000%. Yeah, no, I think what you're pointing to is so astute. There's Rabbi Shaul McGee said something like talking about how Stalin basically said Jewish people can't be a nation if they don't have a language or a country, like a nation state. And many Zionists agreed. And it's this idea of like conforming to the like Western colonial idea of what a people needs to be a people. And I think that's bullshit. And I think we're all here because we think that's bullshit. Using that as a sort of, sorry, also, I don't want to take away the opportunity for you, Max, to speak if you have more you want to say on this topic.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to add on one thing you were, both Z and you were mentioning about, again, kind of like decoupling that belief of Zionism and Judaism. One of my friends, they're a professor at Cal Poly Humboldt, just released a paper on how the University of California was actually a big part of the Zionist project, of how they brought how colonization happened in California of agriculture and bringing that over to Israel. And, you know, when I read that paper, I was like, that's something a lot of people don't know. And those are kind of great examples for people to have of, you know, the undercurrents of what Zionism is, of it is partially American imperialism that we are perpetuating. And it's sad to see other Jews, you know, we've grown up with kind of subscribing to those beliefs because they may not understand where these are actually coming from. They're not coming from Judaism. They're coming from people other than that trying to co-opt our people into committing genocide, and, you know, being complicit in it. So if you're interested in that paper, it is on my Twitter, or if you just search Dr. Gabby Kirk, Cal Poly, you will find it. And it's an excellent, and there's also a presentation, so you can also just watch it. You don't have to read. I did want to talk about the question, as we were talking about how the, you know, stories and games can shape our quest for wholeness. I think we talked a lot about how being in games and storytelling is a way to kind of role play that, role play that experience in a safe way. And I kind of wanted to offer a different perspective on that too. Of I know for me, one source of way I kind of seek that wholeness is, you know, celebrating the joy as well, and just thinking that in a slightly different way. Of that is something I've really enjoyed as kind of a game maker, and creating kind of Jewish experiences is there a way to kind of funnel that joy as an act of resistance, right? And bringing that to the forefront and showing the joy of Judaism. And one example I'll talk about here is a couple of years ago, I had the privilege of taking an online class with a queer and trans yeshiva. And for those that don't know, a yeshiva is a a school of Jewish thought where you're learning about Talmud and just basically old Jewish texts. And this queer trans yeshiva is recontextualizing all of our stories of, people talk about stories of Job, the Leviathan, all of these really old stories we've had. And one thing they really seek to do as a yeshiva is, well, is there a queer or feminist retelling of these stories? When we're translating from language to language, a lot of these stories were spoken and then written down in Aramaic and then translated to Hebrew and then translated to English. There's a lot of room for lost in translation. And one of my favorite stories we talked about in that class is the story of Rabbi Yochanan. This is a rabbi who is in the Talmud from a long time ago. I can't quote the date right now because I don't have it on the top of my head. But they are canonically, if you go back and retranslate that section of the Talmud, they are canonically a trans person in the Talmud. And if you go to, somebody who may be of the conservative belief in Judaism, they may say that is, that's not true. That is a gross misrepresentation. But kind of the cool thing about going back and retranslating is, no, that actually is true. That is a valid translation of our formative text as Judaism, which I think is a very cool experience of Judaism that not other experiences have. So I think when I learned about that, I was like, shoot, I want to make a game about that because I think that's really cool. And that's a way for people, queer, specifically queer and trans Jews, to see themselves in their history and say, no, we're actually kind of rewriting the history a little bit of what our story actually is. And I think there's so much joy in that, and there's a lot of healing in that too. So I just kind of want to offer that as well. Of I love to do that as well, to kind of bring games, bring that Judaism in, and maybe offer a retelling too.
Yeah.
What was that yeshiva's name?
They're called Shel Mala. So SHELMAALA. They are led by Chava de Cordova and Binya Coates. And they are the most awesome people I've ever met on the internet.
That's profoundly cool. And I want, I think they're in some sense two sides of the same coin of empowerment fantasy, right? And I think that just to speak to something that you mentioned with the language transfer, there's this great paper called The Wandering Cap. That's about the idea of gnome hats and their origins in history. Spoilers, a lot of it's kind of anti-Semitic, and that's kind of the point of the paper. But there's this line at the end that has altered my brain chemistry, and it is the notion of cultural transfer as culture as transfer. That inherent, what we perceive as our culture is something it is formed in the passing. It is created in its conveyance. And using that as a sort of segue into what I think will probably be our last sort of topic of discussion, but also if there's anything you want to revisit, use your time how you want to use your time. I think these conversations are so important. Just to talk about the idea that we don't exist in a vacuum, and the space that we're creating in inherently does have a lot of problematic ideas in it. In the if you know my online presence at all, I've talked a lot about the origins of goblins and this pervasive anti-Semitism through history. And I think the question of how do we take the parts we like from these whether it's high fantasy or it's genre is too broad a word, but from these fictional realities that we like, without and making sure not to bring with them any of this sort of practice prejudice that exists in these fictional universes.
This is my favorite topic, because to me it is such a Jewish tradition to go, well, here's this plate of bullshit we've been given. How do we make it work for us? How do we adapt? How do we make it our own? And so harkening back to what I said of I actually like to get into the gritty, the spicy, but in the safe world of this storytelling thing. I think I do like to play a little bit with the way that, for example, D&D, which is the home game that I DM, right? It is so problematic, especially like, I mean, we're not even going to go into like the Hodozi stuff, but like just talking about like goblins, or talking about how like, oh, elves are beautiful and like ethereal unless they are the dark-skinned ones, in which they are inherently evil. So there's so like even just the idea of race and having it come with specific characteristics that you can't opt out of, right? Like, I think that there's so much there. And I like to play with that. I mean, typically what I like to do is just call that ancestry. I don't really like to call it race. But with my players, if someone, say, for example, David plays a kobold in our game, and like those are not considered with the same level of respect as many other ancestries. And like David and I talked about that in this world that was a very problematic world that I'm placing my heroes in order to buck against that system. And we talked about how much we were going to lean into that and how much we wanted that to be a part of his story in terms of rising against, addressing, or in terms of just informing like background. Obviously, this is all dependent on like what someone is willing to dive into 100%. I'm never going to be like, surprise, you have to deal with prejudice here too, even though you don't want to. But I think it is such a very characteristic tradition of our own to go, okay, we've been served this thing. We can either choose to just go along with it, or we can choose to play with it and play against it. So that's definitely something that I have made a passionate, I have a very passionate zeal about sort of exploring in how I play and how I have my players play. But I also think in general, when it comes to approaching these types of tools and finding ways to make them more radically inclusive and liberated, we have to ask ourselves like, all right, how do I want to show up in this space? How do I want to exist in this space? How can I take this thing that I love that is problematic and infuse it and collaborate with others to infuse it to be something that actually works for us? The glory about things like D&D is that there is homebrew. It is constantly a thing that is being updated and revised and expanded upon by folks who look at the original and go, yes, but... and I feel like that's such a Jewish thing. It is such a Jewish thing. And I feel like that's definitely something that I find myself exploring quite a bit with my players. And what I've always tried to do as a player myself is going, okay, I love this, but my loving it does not mean that I'm not going to address a lot of the problems. And I'm going to do it in a way that I feel is beyond just going, I'm going to fix this and then move on. No, I want to like comment on it. I want to dig at it. It's like when you have a wiggle, like a loose tooth, and you kind of want to wiggle it, even though it hurts, because you're like, no, I have to address this thing. That's often how I feel I like to play with that stuff, specifically with all of my intersectionalities at the
I'm
table.
obsessed with the Max Tasha like transition here, because that's exactly how I approach D&D. And I think the idea for me is the source books are translations that I can choose to retranslate in the context. Like, I've taken to reading source books as written by the settler colonists. So in this like modern fantasy RP that we're doing right now, it makes sense that it writes shapeshifters have no culture, because of course, if you're a shapeshifter in diaspora, why would you have a culture? Why would you, why you would be assimilating, you would be doing that. And we really wanted to explore the nuances of a world in very recent post-colonialism. So what does it look like when Fae or, different races, different ancestries have been living far away from, what is pixie culture in diaspora look like, as opposed to pixie culture under settler colonism? No, colonialism. There we go. I can say a word sometimes.
We all knew what you meant.
Yeah, I appreciate you. And I think that for me, you know, the answer to that is something like I completely, I want to just, you know, shout out both Max and Tasha, because I think that looking at the texts that you are provided, I think both of you guys have gone such an interesting way where Max has created these very like Jewish games and Tasha has infused this very Jewish thinking into like existing games as well. It's like you should be approaching the texts written by like mostly old white men with the texts that any old white men write history of, like, yeah, this is their interpretation of what it was. You know, I mean, 100% go in and just do something completely different. But if you are the kind of person who likes that like lore that like exists and want to play with that, what that looks like, to me, I think what's the most fun about that is like now in this world where we don't want to deal with things like, you know, we're not dealing with racism that exists as in like these two races don't interact anymore, but we are dealing with things like, well, my great grandmother was from the Feywild. She doesn't really have a lot of connection to her identity anymore. My identity as a Fey person living in diaspora is extremely different than someone who is living in the Feywild, essentially. I think it's really fun to do exactly as Tasha was saying and essentially reimagine like what purpose does that narrative serve for the person who is writing this text? And
Totally.
if that is relevant to the game, playing along with that.
Yeah, 1,000%. No, I love. I mean, I love the breadth and depth of every like. I really appreciate how much of yourself y'all have been bringing to this. I know we have a hard out in like 30 seconds, and I just wanted to. If anybody has any last. Okay. Well, Rowan, I know you have stuff to do because you're at Gen Con. Bless you. And so if you have any like final remarks, please, floor is yours.
Yeah. Final thoughts. I speak with Eric Silver about this a lot. Eric Silver is the GM of Join the Party. He is a Jewish creator. He runs Multitude. Really fantastic guy. He and I have talked in a couple articles and interviews that I've done with him about this idea of the assumptions kind of that Z was just speaking to, of these baseline assumptions that people have when coming into not just D&D, but tabletop role-playing games in general. And for example, like religion. When you come into a tabletop role-playing game with the assumption of religion, 9 times out of 10, you're going to get a Catholic allegory. You're going to get a Pope at the top. You're going to get the structure underneath. And finding ways to deconstruct that, because everything about Judaism is, like we've been saying this whole time, looking at the things that we've been given and saying, sure, but what else can we do? And a really important part of that, and like bringing in some intersectionality into this, the idea of queerness. Judaism is a very inherently queer platform of ideology. There are 6 different genders within the basis of Judaism. And so bringing this idea that the way that we understand the world to be, the way that we have been taught that the world is actually not the way that it is. And even if we look back at our own selves, if we look at the way that Jews have assimilated into Western culture, to believe that there are only 2 genders, we have forgotten the important parts of our own ideology in favor of becoming part of a larger collective. And a very important thing that we all have to do, like I kind of said at the beginning of this, is take a step back and see what's actually true, and see what actually represents the reality in which we exist, and bringing those truths into our games, even if they're painful, even if they're hard to explore, and making sure that the way that we're playing those games are respecting those truths and respecting the other people at the table. And I am so, so grateful to have shared this space with all of you. This was a really lovely conversation, and fuck Zionism, free Palestine, free Sudan, free the Congo. Have a great day, y'all.
Thank you so much for being here, Rowan. And I'm like would kind of I know, Sean, you had said keep going. I will keep going until you tell us to stop.
I do
And
have to go.
Oh,
yeah,
great.
I do as well.
Cool. No worries. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm so grateful to have shared this space and to be able to have this discussion with you all. If there's anything you want to plug on your way out, please do so.
I'll definitely take that plug. So, definitely, I have games on my itch.io site, hydroforge.itch.io. Go pick up a copy of Hanukkah Goblins. Esther and the Queens will be coming out very, very soon. It'll be available before Big Bad Con in October. So if you want to come play Esther and the Queens with me in person with the printed edition, come to Big Bad Con in October.
Hell yes.
All right, I should do the advertising thing also. Wait, my camera's not going to turn back on, but that's fine. I was talking about Printweaver earlier. It forces you into an identity, and you have to deal with it to play. The first adventure for Printweaver has come out digitally already, and this past week. It's called The End of Amarna, so you can look up N.L. Morrison or Printweaver, and you can find it there. It's about dealing with the aftermath of a genocide. So. And adventuring through a land that's really not exciting to be in, but you're kind of doing your sacred duty to make things a little better. So check it out if you like that sort of thing. And thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you.
Please feel free to check out what happened in the Malachite Waste. It's available all places where podcasts can be found and on Patreon. If you want to support us, we are literally within minutes going to be doing a panel of a one shot that we're running. It's a modern fantasy cozy slice of life RPG about the life of different NPCs, and we explore a lot of modern fantasy Judaism within it.
I love that.
I got nothing, y'all.
Great.
I'm just here for the good time.
Thank you all again. We will mosey off the stage, but I'm so grateful again to have shared this space and to be able to have this dialogue with y'all. Thank you. I forgot what's next, but I'm sure it's great. Bye.
Bye, everyone.